Next, we move on to a news article that really caught my attention for a couple of different reasons, and I'll outline this in our conversation, and that is that prehistoric autism may have been a key factor in the production of, quote, much of the world's earliest great art. This is according to a study, I believe, by York University, where they looked at art. For example, one of the featured paintings is the Wall of Lions in Pont d'Arc. Oh no, I have to say that one. Chauvet. A very famous Paleolithic cave. Really good drawings of animals, basically, and they came to the conclusion that the aptitudes of people on the autistic spectrum would have allowed them to draw these animals with extreme accuracy. Now, this isn't actually the first time that the skill of prehistoric, Paleolithic, early Stone Age artists has been commented on. For example, a couple of years ago, I remember there being a news article that compared the ability of modern artists to sketch an animal to artists' skills as shown often in cave art. That came to the conclusion that prehistoric artists were more, as it were, skilled at capturing the essence of an animal in terms of its biology, how the muscles moved, and this makes perfect sense. After all, they would literally take these creatures apart when they processed them. They relied on them for eating and hunting. May even have played a religious role in their lives, perhaps an element of shamanism going on. So it doesn't, in my opinion, it doesn't require autism. But this led to some interesting conversations. And I mean, first of all, what do you make of this sort of assertion?
Well, first of all, I think it's important to say that the current article, and it got quite a lot of press coverage, particularly in the broadsheet press, certainly in the UK, is based on an article that's been published in Open Archaeology, and people can read it and online and download a copy. So, again, shout out, all credit to them for making it open access. But when I started looking at it, and as you know, and I've said many times in these conversations, I'm not a prehistorian, so I come sort of fresh to any conversations that we have about prehistoric subjects. And when I started looking around this one, two things struck me. First of all, this isn't a new suggestion. It's actually the latest part of a conversation that's been going on for at least 20 years, and I've got open in front of me at the moment another paper that people can find. It's from the Cambridge Archaeological Journal of 1998, and it's a paper by Nicholas Humphrey called Cave Art, Autism and the Evolution of the Human Mind. And in that one, Humphrey, and I'm quoting from the abstract here, I argue in the light of this comparison that the existence of cave art cannot be the proof which it's usually assumed that the humans of the Upper Paleolithic had essentially modern minds. This argument is about how did our prehistoric ancestors think? And did they think, were their thought processes, were their processing of issues like concepts of self, concepts of nature, concepts of art even, analogous to the ones that we have now, or that we discuss now, or actually are we dealing with a completely different mental landscape? So I think it's perfectly legitimate to ask the questions, but actually in the end we're never going to know.
No, but you can get very close. I think we may have mentioned this in a previous watching brief, but I know you and I, in our conversations, we've previously touched on the idea that until people like Stephen Mython started consulting with neuroscientists, archaeologists hadn't spoken, it seems, to anyone who studies the brain to examine how it is the brain might have evolved. Mython was quite scathing of that and quite astonished, so you can get closer than what some of the speculations that have been made by archaeologists in the past might allow. But I think the problem here, and this isn't the first news story this year that seems to have potentially overstepped its mark in terms of its conclusions. I'm thinking of Cheddar Man, for example. in this instance, for example, we have a quote certainly in the Guardian article, where the someone suggests that the key one of the key factors here is the ability to draw realistically, and that supposedly people who are more autistic, as apparently we're all on the spectrum, but people with high autistic traits are more likely to be realistic artists, as it were. Now that may well be true, but this leads to three things come to mind immediately. First of all, it leads to the notion that only autistic people draw realistically. That's simply not true. Secondly, there's an undercurrent here, and this is something that came out in the RKC Facebook page, that all, as it were, divergent brains, all brains that aren't modern, Western, fully adapted brains. So, for example, I mean, I count myself in that lot, in so much as I'm fairly dramatically dyslexic. All of them have positive associations, necessarily positive, otherwise they wouldn't be here. It's the argument that this stuff would be, as it were, bred out of society if it didn't have positive connotations.
Yeah, it's the evolutionary advantage is the words they use, aren't they? I think.
No, exactly, yeah, exactly. And that's not necessarily true. For example, people who are profoundly depressed, there's very little positive there. But also, the third thing that I'm aware of is the fact that this sort of study doesn't seem to be taking into account the volume of literature that's been put into the cultural context of the art being produced. In particular, for example, a few years ago, I remember a piece of research showing that children had access to these caves. That you have people from all sorts of different walks of life, different age groups, it seems, going into the caves and doodling on the walls. And this wasn't. I mean, so the percentage that's quoted here is only 10%, roughly, of people with autism are high-functioning savants, as it were.
That's a fair. Sorry, go on.
No, I'm just saying, and so I think, as you were just touching on, that this sort of research either suggests that in the past more people were savant, as it were, or it's suggesting that this sort of art was basically people were being funneled into those caves. Oh, you're autistic, go into the cave and draw something.
This is and that's where it breaks down for me. I mean, one comment on the on the basis of this, going back to Humphrey's paper again, and it's cited in other accounts that I've read that followed on from the argument Humphrey started. He was quoting a particular study of an autistic girl called Nadia, who produced graphics that were superficially similar to cave art.
Yeah.
It quotes in content and style. Now, to me, superficially similar isn't a connection; it's a suggestion. But as you were so rightly saying, anybody with the right training and maybe a modicum of talent, if we believe that certain brains are more capable of expressing themselves in that artistic form than maybe others, can produce a realistic drawing of a prehistoric horse. And particularly when you see it, you're liable to see it on most days of your life.
Yeah,
and and run alongside it, and and so I think at root, while I fully accept there's a legitimate and a fascinating study in how the human brain has evolved, and what inferences we can make about how our ancestors, not just in prehistory but at other times in history, how they prioritized thought and whether their thought patterns vary from the ones we recognize today. I do, by saying, cave art is the result of the autistic spectrum, I think we're in danger of another magic bullet theory.
Yes.
That we're reducing complexity to a single answer.
Well, yes, and I mean, to use a modern analogy, you couldn't say that's a you couldn't say that one type of person was responsible for all forms of graffiti in Britain. You know,
No, very much so.
there are people do graffiti for variated reasons. They come from
Yeah.
various backgrounds. Some people even essentially are multimillionaires because of graffiti. Other people are, deeply entrenched in unemployment. It's just so there's that part, but also something else that does concern me here is the primacy of realism in this conversation. The idea that realism is necessarily good art and was the goal of this art. Now,
Yes.
some of it is seemingly quite abstract. Some of it is highly realistic. But this, I think, this is one of the reasons why, and arguably, I would be very surprised if people involved with this study weren't in this as a group as well. One of the reasons why we tend to have this idea that there are good and bad artists. Oh, I can't draw. You'll hear people say, I've never been good at art, and that's because they can't immediately reproduce, say, photorealism. In particular, perspective is something that often escapes people, and yet actually some of the greatest artists of all time, for example, Picasso, was an excellent draftsman. He could draw photorealistically. He was an extraordinary artist, but he spent his career trying to unlearn that. He was trying to find a childish, in the nicest way, a naive perspective on art.
But also artists, Picasso and artists of that period were also looking. They were working at the time this cave art was first being discovered,
Yeah,
Altamira and Lascaux and so on. They were being inspired by some of those images, and also by modern images from non-industrialized cultures.
yeah, yeah.
So
And so in that vein, I can't help but wonder whether there was an element here of perhaps needing to go back to a sort of a first principles and ask ourselves, what is it that we admire about cave art, and why are we drawn to that? Because as you touched on, there's this question of whether or not prehistoric, especially last glacial maximum brains, were, as it were, fully modern human beings. I happen to believe they likely were, um, but fully modern is not the same as culturally current.
exactly, exactly.
And I think that's a key issue here. There's something though that I'll just pull out as just like at the end of this video, this segment, sorry, and that is from the Guardian, and so the Independent article again, sorry. Harsh conditions favoured the natural selection of genes which predisposed some humans to develop abilities to focus on tasks in great detail for long periods of time, to perceive their environments in three-dimensional terms in an enhanced way, and to develop greater image retention abilities, and to develop greater aptitudes to identify and analyse patterns of geography and movement. That may well be true, but just in this context of culturally current, these are all skills that we know historic and prehistoric cultures from around the world fairly universally had. For example, one of the greatest feats of mental retention is things like the Iliad and frankly the Bible. People remembered this stuff before it was written down. We know that medieval poets, for example, I know that for example in Wales, poets would have to remember, the equivalent of a library, and they just go away and do it, and they'd have to train and have to focus. These amazing feats of memory, perception, and artistic output are entirely within most people's grasp.
Well, exactly.
It's just that
I mean,
we
I would
don't have to do it these
I mean,
days.
a wonderful example. The actor. I mean, we're both, as you know, huge fans of a certain movie franchise involving a professional archaeologist of possibly sometimes dubious morality and ethics. But in one, people might remember the actor Julian Glover playing the villain in one of the Indiana Jones movies. One of the things that one of the highlights of Julian Glover's career was a one-man show where he recited Beowulf.
Yeah.
And for a modern actor, memorizing two and a half hours of material and keeping it in their head alongside all the other parts that they've learned. You know, a Lear or a Hamlet or whatever. You know, that's not unusual. In fact, it's routine. It's what they're trained to do.
Yeah.
They train their brains to do that.
Yeah.
Whereas you and I don't. You know.
Well, hence this massive bookshelf.
Precisely.
Yeah. Yeah.
But actually thinking about, and it's a rather beautiful thought. But people might remember as well the Ray Bradbury short story Fahrenheit 451 about the deliberate destruction of literature, where literature and art is saved by individuals learning a book. So, you know, somebody's Pride and Prejudice and somebody's The Great Gatsby. To prevent this being destroyed by a totalitarian government that wants to destroy independent thought. So, you know, these are issues that are current in the social and literary and cultural discourse. And again, as I just get back to the while I think, you know, studies of brain and the evolution of the brain are fascinating and necessary and whatever. I again, we have to beware the magic bullet.
Yeah. And I suppose just just to bring it back to the particular research. Then, I mean, I'm not trying to say that these guys are wrong, and I'm also not trying to just pull apart their hard work. You know, but I would be interested to know, and maybe one day to have a sit down and a bit of a talk with them about some of these first principles questions, and the context in which they believe that these values would have been, or so these attributes would have been valued, certainly.